In the deepest vaults of forgotten knowledge, where the echoes of ancient wars still whisper through corridors of time immeasurable, there exists a question that few have dared to ask. It is a question that spans 60 million years of galactic history, bridging the gap between beings older than the stars themselves and a figure who has shaped the destiny of humanity for over 10,000 years. What do the C'tan, those ancient star gods who witnessed the birth of galaxies and the death of civilizations, know about the Emperor of mankind? This is not a simple inquiry. It is a journey into the minds of creatures who existed when the universe was young, who feasted upon the energy of suns and bent reality to their will through sheer mastery of the physical laws that govern existence. These are beings who have seen empires rise and fall across millions of years, who fought wars that scarred the galaxy itself, leaving wounds that still bleed into the present age. And yet, for all their power and ancient knowledge, there exists a blind spot in their understanding, a gap in their perception that prevents them from truly comprehending the being known as the Emperor of mankind. To understand what the C'tan know about the Emperor, we must first understand the C'tan themselves. We must journey back to a time before humanity's ancestors first climbed down from the trees, before the stars that light our skies had formed, to an age when the universe itself was still finding its shape. Only then can we begin to grasp the perspective of these ancient entities and understand both what they know and, perhaps more importantly, what they cannot know about the master of mankind. The story begins not with answers, but with questions. How do beings of pure energy, masters of the material realm, who cannot comprehend the Imperium, perceive a being who exists in both realms simultaneously? What does an entity that feeds on stars and bends the laws of physics understand about a psyche whose power rivals that of gods? When the C'tan look upon the Emperor, if they can be said to look at all, what do they see? And when they encountered him directly, as at least one of them did in ancient times, what knowledge did they carry away from that meeting? These questions have lingered unanswered through the ages, hidden in the fragmented memories of shattered gods and buried beneath layers of imperial secrecy and Necron cunning. But by examining what we know of both the C'tan and the Emperor, by tracing the threads of their histories and understanding the nature of their powers, we can begin to piece together an answer. It is an answer that reveals as much about the fundamental nature of reality in the Warhammer universe as it does about these two forces that have shaped its destiny. So settle in and let us embark on this journey through time and space, through the memories of star gods and the legends of humanity's master. Let us explore what the oldest beings in the galaxy know about one of its most mysterious and powerful inhabitants. Origins of the C'tan, born from stars. To understand what the C'tan know, we must first understand what they are. Their origins stretch back to a time so ancient that even the concept of time, as we understand it, was still forming. According to the fragmentary records that have survived from that primordial age, the C'tan were born during the creation of the universe itself, spawned from the insensate energies unleashed in the churning mass of unimaginable force that marked the dawn of all things. Picture, if you can, the universe in its infancy. The first stars were igniting, massive engines of fusion that would burn for billions of years, transforming hydrogen into heavier elements through the alchemy of nuclear fire. The planets had not yet formed. The void between the nascent suns was empty, save for clouds of gas and the slow dance of gravity pulling matter together into ever larger concentrations. In this primordial landscape, something stirred. From the seas of plasma and the solar flares of those first suns, the first self-aware entities emerged. They were not beings as we would understand them, not creatures of flesh or even of discrete form. They were living energy, conscious currents within the stellar fires, aware, but barely sentient. They had no thoughts as such, no desires beyond the most basic drive to feed and persist. They were parasites of a sort, vast clouds of intelligent energy that wrapped themselves around stars and drew sustenance from the radiation pouring forth from those cosmic furnaces. For countless ages, this was the existence of the Proto-Catan. They drifted through the void on wings fashioned from the universe's electromagnetic field lines, moving from star to star as their current host began to dim and cool. They were alone in a universe that was, for the most part, lifeless and silent. They had no name, for there was no one to name them. They simply were, existing in a state that was more akin to a force of nature than to true consciousness. The stars they fed upon would burn for millions or billions of years, but even that vast span was finite. As each sun died, its resident parasite would move on, seeking fresh fuel for its endless hunger. They shortened the lives of the stars they inhabited by uncounted millennia, draining energy that would otherwise have sustained those stellar furnaces for far longer. But in those ancient days, there was no one to notice or care. The universe was vast and stars were plentiful. This existence continued for perhaps billions of years. The Citan, if they can be called that in their primordial state, remained simple creatures despite their immense power. They had no culture, no society, no ambitions beyond feeding and surviving. They were like sharks in an endless ocean, apex predators in their domain, but no more complex in their thoughts than any other animal. But then, something changed. It began with the Old Ones, those mysterious ancient beings who would become the Catan's greatest enemies. The Old Ones were among the first truly intelligent species to evolve in the galaxy, and they possessed an understanding of the universe that allowed them to reshape it according to their will. They spread across the galaxy, seeding worlds with life, creating species and guiding their evolution. They built the webway, that network of tunnels through reality that allowed them to travel between the stars without braving the hostile environment of the warp. They were, in many ways, the first true civilization in the galaxy. The Old Ones paid little attention to the Citan. Why would they? The star parasites were a curiosity, perhaps, beings of energy that existed in a state completely divorced from the matters that concerned the Old Ones. The two forms of life were so fundamentally different that they might as well have existed in separate universes. The Old Ones worked their will through the Imperium, through what would come to be called the warp. The Citan existed solely in the material realm, and the warp was something they could neither perceive nor influence. It was this separation that would eventually lead to the greatest war the galaxy had ever seen. But before that war could begin, the Citan needed to evolve beyond their primitive state. They needed to become something more than simple parasites, more than unconscious forces of nature. And that transformation would come through their encounter with another species, one whose hatred and desperation would reshape both races forever. The Necrontyr were a species born under a cruel sun. Their homeworld orbited a star that bathed them in deadly radiation, causing cancers and diseases that kept their lifespans brutally short. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, they developed a sophisticated civilization. They became masters of technology, driven by a desperate need to find some way to escape the curse of their poisoned sun. They looked to the stars and saw not beauty, but the source of their suffering. And in their study of those stars, they made a discovery that would change everything. Using their advanced instruments, the Necrontyr detected anomalies in certain stars. There were patterns in the solar flares, variations in the stellar output that could not be explained by natural processes. Something was living within those stars, feeding upon them. The Necrontyr had found the Citan. The discovery came at a crucial time in Necrontyr history. They had recently suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Old Ones. a war that had begun over the Necrontyrs' demand for the secret of immortality. The Old Ones, who possessed such knowledge, had refused to share it with the short-lived and, in their view, unworthy Necrontyr. The resulting war had gone poorly for the Necrontyr, driven to the fringes of the galaxy by an enemy they could not defeat. They were scattered, broken, and desperate for any advantage that might turn the tide. In the Citan, they saw possibility. These beings fed on stars, commanded energies beyond comprehension, and existed in a state that might be called immortal. If the Necrontyr could communicate with them, perhaps even form an alliance, they might gain the power they needed to defeat the Old Ones. More than that, they might find the secret to overcoming death itself. The first contact was established with a Citan that the Necrontyr would name Azagorod, the Nightbringer. It had been born upon the very star that had cursed the Necrontyr race, and its presence had been one of the factors that made their sun so deadly. The process of contact was complex, requiring the Necrontyr to build what they called an incorporeal starlight bridge, a technological marvel that allowed them to communicate with and eventually transfer the Citan from its stellar home into a body they had prepared for it. That body was made of necrodermis, the living metal that the untold Necrontyr had developed through their mastery of material science. It was a feat of engineering unlike anything that had existed before, a shell of living metal that could contain the essence of a being made of pure energy. When the Nightbringer was incarnated into this new form, something profound happened. The Citan, for the first time in its existence, experienced true limitation. It was no longer spread across the surface of a star, no longer a diffuse cloud of energy. It was compressed into a humanoid form, thousands of miles of energy creature squeezed into a body perhaps 20 feet tall. But this compression did not weaken the Nightbringer. If anything, it focused its power, gave it definition and purpose it had never possessed before. And it brought with it something new, something the Citan had never experienced while feeding on the bland energy of stars. It brought the taste of emotion, the flavor of fear and suffering that radiated from the Necrontyr who had summoned it. The Nightbringer found that it enjoyed this new sensation. It began slaughtering the Necrontyr who had brought it into being, drinking in their terror and anguish as they died. It was only through desperate pledges of servitude that the remaining Necrontyr convinced the Nightbringer to spare them, promising that there were other species beyond number throughout the galaxy, entire civilizations of beings that could be harvested for these delicious emotions. This promise intrigued the Nightbringer, and it agreed to spare the Necrontyr. More than that, it told them of others of its kind, scattered across the stars. If the Necrontyr could provide bodies for these other Citan, if they could awaken them and give them form, then together they might feast upon the galaxy itself. The Necrontyr, seeing in this offer the power they so desperately needed, agreed. One by one, the Citan were awakened and given form. Mephetron the Deceiver, who would prove to be the most cunning and manipulative of all the star gods, Magladroth the Void Dragon, master of the material realm and creator of impossible technologies, Nyadra Zatha, the Burning One, who brought fire and devastation wherever he walked, and others, perhaps dozens or even hundreds of Citan, each taking a form of living metal and experiencing consciousness in a way they never had before. In their new bodies, the Citan were transformed. They were no longer simple parasites feeding mindlessly on stellar energy. They had become aware, intelligent, and ambitious. They had tasted the terror and suffering of living beings and found it far more satisfying than the flavorless energy of stars. They had gained worshippers in the Necrontyr, beings who revered them as gods and offered them servitude. And they had found enemies in the Old Ones, whose mastery of the warp represented everything the Citan could neither understand nor control. The stage was set for the war in heaven, a conflict that would reshape the galaxy and echo through history for millions of years to come. The Citan, awakened and empowered, were ready to assert their dominion over the material realm. And in doing so, they would gain knowledge of the galaxy and its inhabitants that would inform their understanding of all things, including, eventually, a being yet to be born on a distant world called Earth. The War in Heaven. When gods walked, the war in heaven was not a single conflict, but rather a series of catastrophic engagements that spanned millions of years and encompassed the entire galaxy. It was a war between fundamentally different forms of existence, between masters of the material realm and lords of the Imperium, between those who sought dominion through technology and those who wielded the power of the warp itself. To call it the greatest war in galactic history would be an understatement of cosmic proportions. At the beginning of the war, the C'tan and their Necrontyr servants faced a seemingly impossible challenge. The Old Ones were the undisputed masters of the galaxy, possessed of technologies and abilities that the Necrontyr could scarcely comprehend. Their webway allowed them to travel anywhere in the galaxy instantaneously, striking at will and retreating before the Necrontyr could mount an effective defense. Their understanding of biology allowed them to create and modify life with ease, filling worlds with creatures designed to serve their purposes. And their mastery of psychic power gave them abilities that appeared to be nothing less than magic to the materialistic Necrontyr. The early stages of the war went badly for the Necrontyr and their C'tan allies. Despite the awesome power of the star gods, despite the advanced technology of the Necrontyr, they could not overcome the Old Ones' mobility advantage. The webway was the key to Old Ones' strategy, allowing them to position their forces anywhere they were needed and escape before they could be destroyed. The Necrontyr found themselves perpetually on the defensive, unable to strike back effectively against an enemy that could appear and disappear at will. But the C'tan were nothing if not patient, and they were learning. With each engagement, they studied the tactics and technologies of the Old Ones, seeking weaknesses that could be exploited. And they were developing their own capabilities, learning to use their godlike powers in ways that they had never attempted before. The C'tan had spent billions of years as simple parasites, but they were no longer simple. They were gods of the material realm, and they were beginning to understand the full scope of their power. It was the Deceiver who suggested the next step in the war, a step that would transform the Necrontyr forever and give the C'tan the servants they needed to prosecute their war effectively. He proposed what came to be called biotransference, the process by which the Necrontyr would abandon their flesh entirely and transfer their consciousness into bodies of living metal. The Deceiver promised that this would grant the Necrontyr the immortality they had always sought, freedom from the diseases and short lifespans that had plagued them since the beginning of their existence. The reality of biotransference was far different from what the Deceiver promised. When the Necrontyr entered the furnaces that would transform them, they did not emerge as improved versions of themselves. They emerged as something else entirely, beings of living metal, with their memories and personalities intact, but their souls ripped away and fed to the hungry C'tan. The Necrontyr became the Necrons, immortal but soulless, their capacity for emotion and creativity diminished or destroyed entirely. They had become the perfect soldiers for the C'tan's war, tireless and fearless, incapable of questioning their master's commands. With the transformation complete, the true war in heaven began. The C'tan, glutted on the life force of billions of Necrontyr souls, were at the height of their power, and they commanded an army of Necrons that numbered in the countless billions, warriors that could not tire, could not feel fear, and would fight until destroyed and then repair themselves to fight again. The tide of the war began to turn, armed with weapons of godlike power and ships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye. The C'tan and Necrons fought as one. The Old Ones' defenses began to crumble under the relentless assault. Planets were razed, their populations harvested to feed the insatiable hunger of the star gods. Suns were extinguished, leaving entire solar systems in perpetual darkness. And in perhaps the most terrifying display of C'tan power, black holes were summoned into being by the reality-warping abilities of the star gods, devouring whole star clusters and leaving nothing but gravitational scars in the fabric of space-time. The Old Ones, for the first time in their long existence, found themselves on the defensive. Their webway fortresses, once thought impregnable, fell to Necron assault. One of the C'tan, Nyadrazatha, the Burning One, showed the Necrons how to breach the webway's extra-dimensional boundaries using constructs called dolmen gates. These living stone portals allowed the Necrons to invade the webway itself, turning the Old One's greatest advantage into a vulnerability. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. The war came to every corner of the galaxy, and the Old One's carefully constructed empire began to fall apart. In their desperation, the Old Ones took a fateful step. They began creating new species, races with even stronger connections to the warp than they had attempted before. The Aeldari, the Krork, the Canib, the Rashan, and others were engineered and uplifted, given powers and abilities specifically designed to fight the C'tan. These young races wielded psychic abilities that could harm the star gods, for the warp was anathema to the C'tan. Where Necron weapons simply destroyed matter and energy, psychic attacks struck at something the C'tan could neither understand nor defend against effectively. For the first time since they had received their bodies of living metal, the C'tan found themselves facing a credible threat. The energies of the warp were poison to them, and the psychic races created by the Old Ones could call upon those energies with ever-growing skill. The war, which had seemed to be moving inexorably towards C'tan victory, suddenly became uncertain again. But the Old Ones' desperate gambit had unintended consequences. By creating so many psychic races and encouraging them to use their abilities on such a massive scale, by filling the galaxy with war and death and suffering on an unprecedented level, the Old Ones were fundamentally changing the nature of the warp itself. The Imperium, which had once been relatively calm, became turbulent. The psychic emanations of countless dying beings began to coalesce in the warp, forming the seeds of what would eventually become the Chaos Gods. And from this turmoil emerged a new threat, one that neither the C'tan nor the Old Ones had anticipated. The Enslavers came, creatures of pure warp energy that could possess and control living beings, turning entire populations into mindless slaves. The Enslavers spread like a plague across the galaxy, targeting psychic species in particular. The young races that the Old Ones had created, the very weapons they had forged to fight the C'tan, became vectors for this new horror. The Old Ones found their carefully constructed empire collapsing not from Necron assault, but from within, as world after world fell to the Enslaver plague. The C'tan, immune to possession by virtue of their complete separation from the warp, continued their advance even as the Enslavers consumed the galaxy. They hunted down the scattered Old Ones, destroying the last remnants of that ancient civilization. Whether the Old Ones went extinct or simply fled the galaxy is unknown, but their time as the galaxy's dominant power was over. The war in heaven had been won by the C'tan and their Necron servants, but victory came at a terrible price. The C'tan had spent much of their energy in the long war. More than that, they had begun to turn on each other. The deceiver, true to his name, had convinced the star gods that they themselves were the greatest feast to be had, that the energy of a C'tan was far more delicious than any mortal soul. The C'tan fell into civil war, with the stronger ones consuming the weaker, absorbing their essence and power. This internal conflict weakened the C'tan at precisely the moment when they should have been celebrating their victory. And it was at this moment that Zarek, the silent king of the Necrons, made his move. He had never forgotten the horror of biotransference, had never forgiven the C'tan for what they had done to his people. Throughout the war in heaven, he had been biding his time, waiting for the moment when the C'tan would be vulnerable. Now that moment had come. The Silent King led the Necrons in revolt against their masters. Using weapons that focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe, weapons specifically designed to harm beings of pure energy, the Necrons assaulted the C'tan. It was a desperate gambit, for the C'tan, even weakened, were still godlike in their power. But the Necrons had numbers on their side, and more importantly, they had surprise. The C'tan, arrogant in their power and distracted by their internal conflicts, did not see the attack coming until it was too late. The C'tan could not be destroyed entirely, for they were fundamental aspects of reality itself, beings that had existed since the dawn of the universe. But they could be shattered, their consciousness fragmented into countless shards, each one containing a portion of the original's power and personality. The Necrons imprisoned these shards in multidimensional prisons called tesseract labyrinths, devices that could contain even a C'tan's reality warping abilities. One C'tan, Yandugor the Flayer, was destroyed entirely in the assault, but it cast a final curse upon the Necrons, afflicting them with what became known as the Flayer virus. Other C'tan may have escaped into stasis, hiding from their former servants. And one, Zaranoga the Outsider, had already retreated into isolation, driven mad by the experience of consuming other C'tan and too terrible to be defeated. But most of the C'tan were shattered and imprisoned, their vast power now fragmented and contained. The Necrons had won their freedom, but at a terrible cost. The war had depleted them as well, and the Silent King realized that the time of the Necrons was over, at least for the moment. The Eldari, one of the psychic races created by the Old Ones, were poised to inherit the galaxy. The Necrons could not stand against them in their weakened state, so the Silent King ordered his people into stasis. Across the galaxy, the Necrons retreated to tomb worlds, vast underground complexes where they would sleep for millions of years, waiting for a time when the galaxy would once again be suitable for their kind. They took their C'tan shards with them, keeping these fragments of their former masters as unwilling weapons to be deployed when the Great Awakening finally came. The war in heaven was over. The galaxy lay in ruins, its surface scarred by conflicts that had seen the deaths of countless trillions, the extinction of entire species, and the fundamental alteration of the warp itself. The C'tan, once the undisputed masters of the material realm, were reduced to shards, fragments of their former glory, imprisoned by their own former servants. And in the wake of this cosmic catastrophe, the stage was set for the rise of new civilizations and new conflicts. But the knowledge that the C'tan had gained during the war in heaven did not disappear with their shattering. Each shard retained some portion of the original C'tan's memories and understanding, and those memories included everything they had learned during their time as awakened star gods. They had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. They had witnessed the power of the warp and the beings that dwelt within it. They had learned to recognize different forms of power, different manifestations of reality, altering ability. This knowledge would remain with them through their long imprisonment, carried forward into an age when new powers would arise in the galaxy, powers that would in some ways mirror those the C'tan had encountered during the war in heaven. And one of those powers would be a being born on a distant world, a being who would, millions of years after the war in heaven had ended, prove himself capable of defeating at least one shard of the ancient star gods. The nature of C'tan perception. To understand what the C'tan know about the Emperor, we must first understand how they perceive reality itself. The C'tan are not beings like you or I. They do not see the universe through eyes that detect reflected light, do not hear through ears that process vibrations in the air, do not touch with flesh that can sense pressure and temperature. Their perception of reality is fundamentally different from that of any organic being, and this difference shapes what they can and cannot know about other entities they encounter. The C'tan are masters of the material realm. This is not simply a title or a boast, but a literal truth. They exist as beings of pure energy, given form through bodies of living metal, and their consciousness is intimately connected to the physical laws that govern the universe. When a Satan perceives something, it does not simply see an object or a being. It perceives the fundamental forces that compose that thing, the electromagnetic fields that bind its atoms, the strong and weak nuclear forces that hold its particles together, the gravitational influences it exerts and experiences. Imagine for a moment that you could see not just the surface of things, but their essential nature. You would look at a star and see not a ball of glowing gas, but a complex interplay of fusion reactions, each one transforming lighter elements into heavier ones through the alchemy of nuclear force. You would see the magnetic fields that twist and spiral across its surface, the solar winds that stream outward from its corona, the gravity well that curves space-time around it. You would understand, at a glance, exactly how much energy it contains, how long it has been burning, how much time remains before it exhausts its fuel. This is something like how a Satan perceives the physical universe. They see reality at its most fundamental level, understanding the interplay of forces and particles with a clarity that no organic mind could match. This perception extends to living beings as well, at least in their physical aspects. When a Satan encounters a living creature, it perceives the unki, electromagnetic patterns that constitute the creature's nervous system, the chemical reactions that power its metabolism, the structural integrity of its body. It can see disease and weakness, strength and vitality, all written in the language of physics and chemistry. But this extraordinary perception comes with a profound limitation. The Satan exists purely in the material realm, and the warp is completely invisible to them. They cannot perceive psychic energy. They cannot sense souls. They cannot comprehend the immaterial dimension that overlaps with physical reality at every point. To a Satan, the warp is not simply mysterious or difficult to understand. It literally does not exist in any way they can detect or interact with. This creates a fundamental blind spot in Satan perception. When they look at a psyker, they see the physical body, the electrical patterns in the brain, the biological mechanisms that allow the psyker to function. But they cannot see the psychic power that the psyker wields. They cannot detect the connection to the warp that gives the psyker their abilities. It is as if they are looking at only half of what exists, seeing the shadow of something, while the thing itself remains forever beyond their perception. To make matters worse, the warp is not merely invisible to the Satan, it is actively harmful to them. Psychic attacks can damage a Satan in ways that physical weapons cannot. The energies of the Imperium are anathema to their very existence. This creates a situation where the Satan face a threat they cannot fully perceive or understand, a form of attack that strikes from what is, to them, an impossible direction. During the war in heaven, this limitation nearly cost the Satan their victory. The psychic races created by the Old Ones could harm the star gods in ways that conventional weapons could not. The Satan found themselves facing enemies who wielded powers that seemed to come from nowhere, that bypassed their defenses and struck directly at their essence. They learned to recognize the signs of psychic power, the way reality seemed to bend and warp around psychers, even if they could not perceive the psychic force itself. But they never truly understood it. How could they, when the very nature of the warp was forever beyond their perception? This brings us to another crucial aspect of Satan perception, the nature of their memories. When the Necrons shattered the Satan, they did not destroy the star god's consciousness entirely. Instead, they fragmented it, breaking each Satan into countless shards, each one containing a portion of the original being's awareness and power. These shards are not simply pieces of the original, they are independent entities with their own thoughts and experiences, though they retain some connection to their source. The memories contained within each shard are incomplete and fragmented, A shard might remember events from the war in heaven, but only certain moments, certain encounters. It might possess knowledge of technologies or tactics, but lack the context that would explain why those things matter. Each shard contains elements of the original Satan's personality, but those elements are magnified and distorted by the process of shattering. A Satan that was cunning becomes even more manipulative in its shards. One that was cruel becomes sadistic beyond measure. These fragmented memories are further complicated by the vast spans of time involved. The Satan were shattered millions of years ago, and many shards have spent that entire time locked away in tesseract labyrinths, experiencing nothing, learning nothing. When they are released into the present day, whether as weapons deployed by Necron dynasties or as escaped entities pursuing their own agendas, they are in many ways creatures of the past, trying to understand a present they do not recognize. Moreover, the shards' understanding of their own former power is incomplete. None of them can fully recall the omnipotent being they once were when they were whole. They retain the personality and hubris of that far vaster and more powerful entity, but not its complete knowledge or capabilities. This creates a peculiar situation where the shards are simultaneously ancient beyond measure and oddly ignorant, possessing fragmentary knowledge of things that happened millions of years ago, but lacking crucial context or understanding. All of this shapes what the Satan shards can know about the Emperor. Their perception is limited to the material realm, preventing them from fully comprehending his psychic nature. Their memories are fragmented, meaning that even if one shard encountered the Emperor, that knowledge might not be complete or accessible to other shards. Their understanding of reality is shaped by an age when the galaxy was very different, when the powers they face now did not exist. Yet despite these limitations, the Satan are far from ignorant. They have existed for billions of years. They have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They have encountered beings of immense power before. Even if those beings wielded forms of power the Satan could not fully comprehend. They know how to recognize strength, how to assess threat, how to understand an opponent's capabilities, even if they cannot perceive all the mechanisms by which those capabilities operate. When a Satan shard encounters the Emperor, it perceives certain things with perfect clarity. It sees a being of immense physical presence, a body that has been augmented and enhanced beyond what should be possible for organic life. It perceives the electrical patterns in the Emperor's mind, far more complex and powerful than those in any normal human brain. It can sense the way reality itself seems to respond to the Emperor's will, the way probability bends and shifts in his presence. But what the shard cannot see is the psychic might that underlies all of this, the connection to the warp that makes the Emperor who he is. It cannot perceive the soul that burns within him like a star, the psychic presence that dwarfs all but the greatest of demons. It can sense the effects of the Emperor's power, but not the source, can see the shadow without the substance. This incomplete perception shapes everything the Satan can know about the Emperor. They recognize him as powerful, perhaps even as a genuine threat to their existence. They understand that he commands abilities they cannot replicate or fully counter, but they do not and cannot truly comprehend what he is, because a fundamental aspect of his being exists in a realm they cannot access. And perhaps, in some strange way, this very incomprehensibility makes the Emperor more threatening to them. The Satan are used to understanding the universe in complete and perfect detail. They are masters of the material realm, beings whose grasp of physics and reality is unparalleled. To encounter something they cannot fully understand, something that operates according to principles they cannot perceive, is profoundly unsettling. It strikes at the core of what they are, challenges their mastery in a way that even the defeat they suffered at the hands of the Necrons did not. For in that defeat, they at least understood the mechanisms of their downfall. The weapons used against them were sophisticated applications of material laws, energies focused and deployed in ways that could harm even a Satan. But the Emperor represents something else entirely, a being who bridges both realms, who wields power that the Satan can sense but not see, can feel but not measure. He is, to them, a contradiction, a being that should not exist according to their understanding of reality. And it is this contradiction, this fundamental incompatibility between what the Satan are and what the Emperor is, that defines the limits of their knowledge about him. The Emperor's ancient origins. To understand what the Satan might know about the Emperor when they encounter him, we must first understand what the Emperor actually is. His nature and origins are shrouded in mystery and contradiction, with different accounts providing different explanations for his existence. But by examining what is known and comparing it to what the Satan have experienced, we can begin to piece together what they might perceive when they look upon the master of mankind. According to the most widely accepted account, though one that may or may not be literally true, the Emperor's origin lies in the distant past of human history, specifically around the year 8000 before the Common Era. This places his birth during the Neolithic period, when humanity was just beginning to transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural settlements. It was an age when the written word did not exist, when the great civilizations of antiquity were still millennia in the future, when humanity numbered in the millions rather than the billions. In this ancient time, humans possessed something that would become increasingly rare in later ages, a relatively clear connection to the Imperium. Some individuals, the shamans and wise ones of their tribes, could perceive the warp and draw upon its power for healing, divination, and other purposes. These early psychers were humanity's first attempts at understanding and harnessing the invisible forces that surrounded them. But the shamans became aware of a growing danger. The warp was changing, becoming more turbulent and hostile. Entities were forming in its depths, predatory creatures that fed upon human souls. When a shaman died, their consciousness would enter the warp, but instead of persisting there in some form of afterlife, they were being devoured by these warp predators. The accumulated wisdom and power of generations of shamans was being lost, consumed by beings that humanity could neither fight nor escape. The shamans came together from across the world, gathering in a place and time that has been lost to history. They made a decision that would change the course of human history forever. Through a ritual mass suicide, they would all die at once, and their combined souls would merge in the warp, creating a single consciousness with the accumulated power and knowledge of all of them. This Gestalt being would be powerful enough to resist the predators of the warp, and it would be reborn as a single human with all of their combined strength. The ritual was performed, and a year later, a child was born to a family in Anatolia. That child possessed within him the combined souls of thousands of shamans, their knowledge, their power, their purpose. He was a perpetual, an immortal being who would not age and who could regenerate from almost any injury. He was the most powerful psyker humanity had ever produced, or would ever produce naturally. He was the being who would eventually become known as the Emperor of mankind. Of course, this account may be apocryphal. The Emperor himself has remained deliberately vague about his origins, and different sources provide different explanations for his existence. Some suggest he might be a product of the dark age of technology, a weapon created by humanity at the height of its power and left to survive the age of strife. Others propose different mechanisms for his birth, different explanations for his power. The truth may be a combination of multiple factors, or it may be something else entirely. What is certain is what the Emperor became in the ages following his birth. He did not immediately reveal himself to humanity. Instead, he walked among them in secret, watching their development, occasionally intervening to guide events in subtle ways. He assumed many identities throughout history, appearing as various historical figures whose true nature was never fully understood. He fought against the forces of chaos when they threatened humanity, battled Xenos when they posed a danger, and worked to promote peace and unity among human civilizations. For thousands of years, this was his pattern. The being who would become the emperor served as humanity's hidden guardian, a force working behind the scenes to ensure the species' survival and development. He witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. He saw the development of agriculture, the invention of writing, the building of the first cities. He walked through ancient Sumeria and Egypt, through classical Greece and Rome, through the ages of exploration and enlightenment. And through it all, he accumulated knowledge and power, preparing for a time when humanity would need him to step forward from the shadows. During the Age of Strife, when humanity's first stellar empire collapsed and thousands of worlds were isolated by warp storms, the Emperor made his move. He began the unification wars on Terra, forging the scattered nations and factions of Earth into a single empire under his rule. He revealed his power openly for the first time, demonstrating abilities that marked him as something beyond human. He created the Thunder Warriors, the Primarchs, and eventually the Space Marines, each one a feat of genetic engineering that drew upon knowledge accumulated over millennia. But to focus solely on what the Emperor became in the Age of Imperium is to miss what is most relevant to our question. What matters for understanding what the Citan might know about him is what he was in the ancient past, before the Imperium, before even recorded human history. This is the Emperor that at least one Citan shard encountered, and it is this version of the Emperor that shaped whatever knowledge that shard carried away from their meeting. In those ancient times, the Emperor was already immensely powerful. He possessed psychic abilities that dwarfed those of any other human. His mastery of the warp allowed him to perceive and manipulate reality in ways that seemed like magic to anyone who witnessed them. He could read minds, influence emotions, project his consciousness across vast distances, and manipulate matter and energy through will alone. He was effectively immortal, his perpetual nature meaning that he could regenerate from injuries that would kill any normal human, and that he did not age. But more than his individual powers, what made the Emperor truly formidable was his understanding. He had spent thousands of years studying the universe, learning its secrets, accumulating knowledge from countless sources. He understood the warp and its dangers better than perhaps anyone else in the galaxy. He had encountered the forces of chaos and understood what they were and what they wanted. He had studied the ruins and artifacts of older civilizations, learning from their successes and failures. This combination of raw power and accumulated wisdom made the Emperor a being of unique capabilities. He was not merely a powerful psyker, he was a master strategist and tactician who had been refining his skills for millennia. He was not just a warrior, he was a scientist and engineer who understood the deepest secrets of physics and biology. He was all of these things and more, a being who existed at the intersection of multiple forms of power and knowledge. And critically, he was a being who existed in both realms simultaneously. The Emperor was profoundly connected to the warp, his soul burning with psychic power that made him visible to warp entities across vast distances. But he also had a physical form, a body that walked through the material realm and could interact with it directly. He was not like the Chaos Gods, beings of pure warp energy who could only affect reality through intermediaries. Nor was he like the Satan, beings of material energy who could not perceive or influence the immaterium. He was something in between, or perhaps something that transcended both categories. This dual nature is crucial to understanding what the Satan could and could not know about the Emperor. When they perceived him, they saw the physical aspects clearly. They could observe his body, track his movements, sense the electromagnetic patterns that characterized his brain activity. But the psychic aspect, the connection to the warp that was arguably the most important part of what made him who he was, remained invisible to them. It would be as if they were looking at a two-dimensional projection of a three-dimensional object. They could see certain aspects clearly, could make certain observations, and draw certain conclusions. But the full picture, the complete understanding of what they were facing, would forever elude them. The Emperor was, in a very real sense, more than they could comprehend, not because of any failure on their part, but because of the fundamental limitations of their perception. And yet, despite this limitation, one shard of the Satan did encounter the Emperor in ancient times. One shard learned something about him, gained some measure of knowledge that it would carry forward through the ages. That encounter, and what it revealed, forms the foundation of whatever understanding the Satan have of the being called the Emperor of mankind. The Dragon of Mars. A direct encounter. Of all the Khitan shards that have existed across the ages, one holds a unique position in the history of the Emperor of mankind. This is the shard of Magladroth, the Void Dragon, the most technologically advanced of all the star gods, master of the material realm in a way that even other Khitan could not match. This shard's encounter with the Emperor in ancient times represents the most direct contact between a Khitan and the master of mankind, and the knowledge gained from that encounter shapes much of what the Satan might understand about him. The story begins in the aftermath of the war in heaven. The Satan had been shattered by the Necrons, their consciousness fragmented into countless shards and imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths. Most of these shards were carefully locked away, stored in the tomb worlds that the Necrons built before entering their great sleep. But not all shards were captured immediately. Some escaped, fleeing into the void to hide from their former servants. And one of these was a shard of the Void Dragon. This shard was already weakened. It had been involved in wars against other Khitan, fought battles with the Aeldari gods, and survived an assault by multiple Blackstone fortresses simultaneously. According to some accounts, it may have even been attacked by Vol, the Eldari god of the Forge, along with an army of his followers, though what became of Vol in that encounter is unknown. The shard was exhausted, depleted, and seeking a place to rest and recover its strength. It found its way to Terra, the homeworld of a species that was, at that time, barely more than primitive animals. Humanity had not yet developed agriculture, had not yet built cities, had not yet invented writing. They were hunter-gatherers living in small tribes, their total population perhaps numbering in the hundreds of thousands. To the Dragon Shard, they were beneath notice, organisms so insignificant that they barely registered as living beings. The Shard settled on Terra, finding refuge in the planet's crust, where it could rest undisturbed. Perhaps it intended to sleep there until the galaxy had changed enough for it to safely emerge. Perhaps it hoped that other shards would find and reabsorb it, restoring some measure of its former power. Or perhaps it simply needed time to recover from the injuries it had sustained during its long flight from the Necrons. But its presence did not go entirely unnoticed. The dragon's essence, even in its weakened state, radiated an influence that affected the area around it. This influence was subtle, not the overt reality-bending powers that a full Citan could wield, but a kind of resonance that affected the way things worked in its vicinity. Technology became easier to understand and create. Mechanical devices functioned more reliably. The very laws of physics seemed to bend slightly in ways that favored the creation and operation of machines. Thousands of years passed. Humanity evolved, developed agriculture, built the first cities. Civilizations rose and fell across the globe. And all the while, the Dragon Shard rested beneath the surface, its presence a constant but unrecognized influence on human development. It dreamed, if such a being can be said to dream, memories of the war in heaven and its former glory flickering through its fragmented consciousness. Then, sometime between the first and second millennium of the Common Era, everything changed. The Dragon Shard's rest was disturbed by a presence it had not encountered before, a force that pressed down on it with psychic weight, unlike anything it had experienced since the height of the war in heaven. Something was approaching it, something powerful enough to penetrate the earth and sense the dragon's hiding place, something that intended to confront it directly. The Emperor had found the Dragon Shard. How he became aware of its presence is not entirely clear. Perhaps his psychic senses detected the subtle wrongness in the area where the dragon rested. Perhaps he had been tracking the shard for years or even centuries, following rumors and legends to their source. Or perhaps the dragon's dreams had begun to leak into the material world, creating disturbances that drew the Emperor's attention. Whatever the mechanism, the Emperor knew the dragon was there, knew what it was, and knew that it represented a potential threat to humanity's future. According to the memories shared by the Guardian of the Dragon, a being tasked with watching over the Shard's prison, the battle took place near the city of Cyrene in Libya. The Emperor appeared in the guise of a warrior knight, clad in golden armor with a scarlet-plumed helmet, riding a mighty horse as black as midnight. He carried a tall lance of purest silver, from which flew a red and white banner depicting an eagle grasping a bolt of lightning. It was an image that would become familiar across the galaxy in later ages, but in that ancient time, it was simply the heraldry of a lone warrior. The dragon, roused from its rest and forced into physical manifestation, took a form that merged aspects of beast and nightmare. It was described as half-crawling creature, with talons like scythe blades, and half-loathsome bird, with an immense scaled head and a tail 20 meters long. Its eyes burned with malignant fire, and its body was covered in plate-like scales that rippled like liquid mercury when struck, shifting and flowing to deflect attacks. In its breast shone the light of devoured stars, a reminder of the eons it had spent feeding on stellar energy before it had been given form by the Necrontyre. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had been seen on Terra before or since. The Emperor's lance struck at the dragon, repeatedly, but the living metal of its body flowed and reformed, refusing to yield to physical damage. The dragon's talons raked across the Emperor's armor, leaving gouges that should have torn through any material known to human science. And all the while, the dragon breathed fire that could melt stone and vaporize metal, while the Emperor wielded powers that bent reality around him. What the dragon perceived in that battle must have been profoundly confusing. It could sense the Emperor's physical form, could track the movements of his body and the horse he rode. It could observe the lance and armor, could analyze their composition and structure. But there was something else, something the dragon could not perceive directly, but whose effects it could not ignore. Attacks that should have connected were deflected by invisible forces. The Emperor seemed to know where the dragon would strike before it moved. And most disturbing of all, the very substance of reality seemed to respond to the Emperor's will in ways that should not have been possible without Satan-level mastery of the material realm. The dragon was facing a being who wielded two forms of power simultaneously. There was the physical might, impressive enough on its own, augmented strength and speed beyond what any normal human could possess. But overlaying this was something else, a form of power that the dragon could not directly perceive, but which affected the material world nonetheless. It was as if the Emperor was simultaneously fighting with both visible and invisible weapons, attacking from directions the dragon could not anticipate because it could not sense them. Eventually, the Emperor found a weakness. According to the accounts, he thrust his sword beneath the dragon's left wing, striking at a vulnerable point that even the living metal body could not fully protect. The dragon was not destroyed, for even a shard of a Satan is incredibly difficult to kill entirely, but it was defeated. The Emperor bound it with his banner, wrapping the helpless dragon in cloth that somehow could contain a being of such power. But the Emperor did not simply leave the dragon where it lay. He had a plan for it, a use for its presence that would serve humanity's interests in ages to come. Through means that are not entirely clear, possibly involving a combination of physical transport and psychic manipulation of space, the Emperor brought the dragon to Mars, the red planet that orbited Terra at a distance of hundreds of millions of kilometers. On Mars, he imprisoned the dragon in the Noctis Labyrinthus, the labyrinth of night, a vast canyon system that stretched across the planet's surface. The shard was placed deep beneath the Martian crust, secured in a prison that combined both physical containment and psychic bindings. And to ensure it remained there, the Emperor appointed a guardian, a human whose lifespan was extended through the Emperor's power and who was given a fragment of his psychic might to help maintain the dragon's bonds. The placement of the dragon on Mars was not arbitrary. The Emperor understood that the dragon's presence, even while imprisoned, would radiate influence across the planet. That influence would make technology easier to understand and create, would inspire an affinity for machines and mechanical knowledge in anyone who dwelt on Mars. Over the millennia that followed, as humanity expanded into space and colonized the solar system, Mars became the center of technological development. The cult Mechanicus arose, worshipping a machine god that they believed dwelt within Mars. The Adeptus Mechanicus was born, their entire civilization shaped by the subtle influence of the imprisoned dragon. Whether the Emperor intended this specific outcome or simply saw it as a beneficial side effect is unclear. What matters for our purposes is what the dragon shard learned from its encounter with the Emperor. For in that battle, the shard gained knowledge that no other Catan possessed, knowledge that would be carried forward through the ages, even as the dragon remained imprisoned. The dragon learned that there existed a being who could defeat even a Satan shard, despite being born of a species the Satan had barely noticed during the war in heaven. It learned that this being wielded a form of power that the dragon could not fully perceive or understand, a power that seemed to come from outside the material realm. It learned that this being possessed knowledge of how to contain and imprison a Satan shard, suggesting an understanding of Satan nature that should not have been possible for any race other than the Necrons. Most importantly, the dragon learned that this being was not hostile in the way that the old ones had been, not simply seeking to destroy or contain a threat. The Emperor had a purpose for the dragon, a use for its continued existence even in imprisonment. He was not merely an enemy to be fought and defeated or avoided. He was something more complex, a force that operated according to plans and strategies that spanned thousands of years. All of this knowledge remained with the dragon shard as it lay imprisoned beneath Mars. And through the Guardian, who could access some of the dragon's memories, fragments of this knowledge may have been passed on, preserved in stories and legends that spoke of a golden warrior who battled a dragon and bound it beneath the earth. These stories would eventually merge with other legends, becoming associated with various mythological figures across human cultures. But the dragon itself never forgot. Through millions of years of imprisonment, as human civilization rose and fell and rose again around it, the memory of that battle remained. And when the Necrons began to awaken in the 41st millennium, when tomb worlds stirred to life and Satan shards were deployed as weapons once more, that memory would become relevant again. For the dragon's knowledge of the Emperor, incomplete and limited though it was, represented the most direct information any Satan possessed about the master of mankind. What the Catan could know. With our understanding of Satan perception, the Emperor's nature, and the dragon's encounter firmly established, we can now attempt to answer our central question. What could the Satan actually know about the Emperor? This requires us to carefully distinguish between what they can perceive, what they can infer, and what remains forever beyond their understanding. Let us begin with what a Satan shard can directly perceive when encountering the Emperor. They can observe his physical form with perfect clarity, down to the molecular level. They can sense the electromagnetic patterns that constitute his brain activity, far more complex and powerful than those in any normal human brain. They can detect the augmentations that have been made to his body, the ways in which his physical form has been enhanced beyond what natural human biology would allow. They can observe his movements, his reactions, his interactions with the physical environment around him. From these observations, a Khitan shard can draw certain conclusions. They can determine that the Emperor is physically formidable, possessing strength and speed far beyond that of normal humans. They can observe that his body has been modified in ways that suggest both biological engineering and something else, something that cannot be achieved through purely technological means. They can see that his brain operates at a level of complexity that dwarfs that of any other human, suggesting an intelligence far beyond the norm. Moreover, they can observe the effects of his psychic power, even if they cannot perceive the power itself. When the Emperor manipulates reality through his connection to the warp, the results of that manipulation occur in the material realm where the Citan can observe them. They might see matter transform seemingly without physical cause, energy appear from nowhere, or the laws of probability bend in impossible ways. They can detect that reality itself seems to respond to the Emperor's will, even if they cannot sense the mechanism by which this occurs. From these indirect observations, the Citan can infer certain things about the Emperor's capabilities. They can recognize that he possesses a form of reality warping ability, similar in some ways to their own powers, though operating according to different principles. They can understand that he commands forces they cannot directly counter with their mastery of the material realm alone. They can assess the level of threat he represents, calculating that his abilities make him dangerous even to a being as powerful as a Citan shard. The Dragon Shard, specifically, knows more than this. From its direct combat experience with the Emperor, it understands that he is a skilled warrior and tactician, that he can identify and exploit weaknesses even in an opponent as formidable as itself. It knows that he possesses knowledge of Citan nature, understanding how to defeat and imprison them in ways that should not be accessible to any race except the Necrons. It has experienced being bound by the Emperor's power, has felt the weight of his presence pressing down on it with a force that transcends mere physical might. The dragon also knows, from its long imprisonment and observation of human civilization, that the Emperor operates according to plans that span vast time spans. His placement of the dragon on Mars was not a random choice or a simple act of imprisonment. It was a strategic move that would shape the development of human civilization for thousands of years. This suggests a level of foresight and planning that the Citan can appreciate, even if they do not fully understand the mechanisms behind it. But perhaps most significantly, the Citan can recognize something in the Emperor that they encountered during the war in heaven. They faced the psychic races, created by the Old Ones, fought against beings who wielded powers drawn from the warp. They learned to recognize the signs of such power, the way reality seems to bend and flex around psychic entities in ways that have no material cause. And when they perceive the Emperor, they recognize these same signs, these same telltale indicators that they are facing a being connected to that dimension they cannot access. This recognition allows the Citan to place the Emperor in a context they understand. He is, from their perspective, similar to the most powerful psykers they faced during the war in heaven, beings whose abilities could harm even a Citan. But he is also more than that, for the psychic beings of that ancient age did not typically possess the physical presence and material knowledge that the Emperor demonstrates. He is a hybrid of sorts, combining aspects of the material and immaterial in a way that the Citan have not encountered before. The Citan can also infer something about the Emperor's age and experience. The fact that he knew of the dragon's presence on Terra, that he understood how to defeat and imprison it, suggests that he has access to knowledge from the war in heaven or its immediate aftermath. This should not be possible for any human, given that humanity barely existed as a species during that ancient age. The only way the Emperor could possess such knowledge would be if he is extraordinarily old, far older than any normal human lifespan would allow, and if he has access to information sources that predate human civilization. From all of these observations and inferences, the Citan can construct a general understanding of what the Emperor is, at least in terms they can comprehend. They recognize him as an ancient and powerful being, one who wields forces that operate according to principles outside their direct perception. They understand that he represents a genuine threat to them, potentially capable of defeating or imprisoning even a Catan shard. They know that he possesses knowledge that should not be accessible to his species, and that he operates according to long-term plans whose full scope they cannot assess. But this understanding, while not insignificant, is also deeply limited. The Catan cannot perceive the Emperor's connection to the warp, cannot see the psychic power that is fundamental to who he is. They cannot sense his soul, cannot observe the way his consciousness extends into the Imperium. They cannot comprehend the political and spiritual role he plays in human civilization, cannot understand the worship directed toward him by billions of believers, or the way that worship feeds back into his power. More fundamentally, they cannot understand the Emperor's purpose or motivations. The Catan operated during the war in heaven according to relatively simple principles: feed, grow stronger, dominate the material realm. The Emperor's goals are far more complex, involving the preservation and elevation of farthest, humanity, the battle against chaos, the pursuit of knowledge and understanding. These are concepts that have little meaning to beings who are, at their core, predators and parasites given consciousness and power. The Catan also cannot understand the Emperor's connection to humanity itself. To them, he is an individual, albeit an extraordinarily powerful one. They do not fully grasp that he sees himself as part of humanity, that his purpose is defined by his relationship to his species. They cannot comprehend the idea of self-sacrifice for the good of others, cannot understand why a being of such power would spend thousands of years guiding and protecting a species that, from the Catan perspective, is little more than cattle. Perhaps most crucially, the Catan cannot fully assess the Emperor's current state. They do not understand what it means that he sits immobile on the golden throne, his body slowly crumbling while his consciousness battles against the forces of chaos in the warp. They cannot perceive the psychic battle he wages to maintain the Astronomicon and hold back the demonic entities that would otherwise overwhelm Terra. To a Catan observing the Emperor in the 41st Millennium, he might appear weakened, possibly even defeated. But this appearance would be deeply misleading, for the Emperor's true power and his true battle exist in a dimension the Catan cannot perceive. There is one final aspect to consider: the possibility that different shards possess different knowledge about the Emperor. The Dragon Shard encountered him directly, and thus has first-hand experience of his capabilities. But this knowledge is not automatically shared among all shards of the Void Dragon, let alone shards of other Catan. Each shard is somewhat independent, carrying fragments of memories that may or may not overlap with those of other shards from the same original entity. It is possible that other Catan shards have encountered the Emperor at various points in history, though no records of such meetings have survived. The Emperor walked through human history for thousands of years before revealing himself openly, and during that time he may well have crossed paths with other escaped or awakened Catan shards. Each such encounter would have provided the shard involved with some measure of knowledge about him, but that knowledge would not necessarily be shared with other shards. This fragmentation of knowledge is consistent with the nature of the Catan in their current state. They are not a unified force with shared awareness. They are fragments of former gods, each one carrying partial memories, an incomplete understanding of what they once were. Their knowledge of the Emperor is similarly fragmented, scattered across multiple shards that may not even be aware of each other's existence. In summary, what the Catan know about the Emperor is significant, but fundamentally incomplete. They recognize him as powerful and dangerous, as a being who operates according to principles they cannot fully comprehend, as someone who possesses knowledge and abilities that pose a genuine threat to their existence. The Dragon Shard in particular knows that he can defeat and imprison a Catan, that he understands their nature in ways that should not be possible. But the deeper nature of the Emperor, his connection to the warp, his relationship with humanity, his ultimate purposes and goals, all of this remains beyond their understanding. They see the shadow he casts in the material realm, but cannot perceive the substance that casts that shadow. They recognize the effects of his power, but not its source. They know he is dangerous, but cannot fully assess why or to what extent. This incomplete understanding is perhaps the most important thing to realize about what the Satan know of the Emperor. It is not simply that they lack information, it is that they lack the very capacity to perceive the information that would be most crucial to understanding him. They are, in a very real sense, blind to the Emperor's true nature, and this blindness shapes everything about how they can interact with or respond to him. The warp blindness, a fundamental gap. The greatest limitation in the Satan's understanding of the Emperor is not a matter of insufficient data or inadequate observation. It is a fundamental perceptual blind spot, a gap in their very ability to sense and comprehend reality. To truly understand what the Satan cannot know about the Emperor, we must delve deeply into this limitation and explore its implications. The warp is anathema to the Satan. This phrase is used frequently in discussions of their nature, but its full meaning is worth exploring in detail. It does not simply mean that the warp is harmful to them, though it is that. It does not only indicate that they cannot control or manipulate the Imperium, though that is also true. The word anathema suggests something more profound. A fundamental opposition, a complete incompatibility at the most basic level of existence. The Satan are beings of order. They exist as structures of energy and matter, following precise physical laws that can be understood, predicted, and manipulated. Their power comes from their perfect mastery of these laws, their ability to perceive and control the material realm down to its most fundamental particles and forces. They are, in essence, the ultimate expression of the material universe's tendency toward predictable, deterministic behavior. The warp is the opposite of all of this. It is a realm of chaos and emotion, where thoughts and feelings have substance, where cause and effect can flow in reverse, where the very concept of physical law breaks down. It is shaped by consciousness rather than by the interaction of particles and forces. It responds to belief and emotion rather than to mathematical principles. It is, from the perspective of a being that exists purely in the material realm, fundamentally irrational and incomprehensible. This opposition goes beyond simple incompatibility. The Satan do not merely lack the ability to enter or perceive the warp. Their very nature makes such perception impossible. It would be like trying to teach color to a being that has never possessed eyes, or trying to explain sound to something that has never had the capacity to hear. The warp is not simply outside their experience, it is outside their possible experience. No amount of study or practice could give a Satan the ability to perceive or interact with the Imperium, because the capacity to do so is fundamentally antithetical to what they are. During the war in heaven, the Satan learned to recognize the signs of psychic power indirectly. They could observe the effects of warp-based abilities in the material realm, could see reality bending and shifting in ways that had no material cause. They developed strategies for fighting against psychic races, methods that relied on overwhelming material force and the deployment of anti-psychic technologies. But they never truly understood what they were fighting against. They were battling an enemy whose primary weapons existed in a dimension they could not perceive, using powers they could not comprehend. This limitation frustrated the Satan in ways that few things could. They were used to understanding the universe completely, to being able to perceive and manipulate every aspect of physical reality. The existence of a dimension beyond their perception, a realm where forces operated according to principles they could not grasp, was profoundly unsettling. It suggested that their mastery of the universe was incomplete, that there were aspects of reality forever beyond their control. The Void Dragon, according to some accounts, was particularly troubled by this limitation. As the most technologically advanced of the Satan, the master of the material realm in ways that even other star gods could not match, the Void Dragon prided itself on its complete understanding of how things worked. The existence of the warp, a realm of power and possibility that it could neither perceive nor replicate, was a wound to its pride, a reminder that despite all its knowledge and power, there were still mysteries beyond its grasp. Now consider the Emperor in light of this fundamental limitation. The Emperor is not simply connected to the warp. He is, in many ways, defined by that connection. His consciousness exists simultaneously in both realms, his soul burning with psychic power that makes him visible to warp entities across vast distances. His greatest abilities, the ones that truly set him apart from even other perpetuals or powerful psychers, come from his mastery of the Imperium. He can navigate the warp, communicate across it, draw upon its power to reshape reality in ways that no purely material being could match. When a Citan perceives the Emperor, it sees the material aspect clearly. It observes a human body, admittedly one that has been enhanced far beyond normal human limitations, but still recognizably a physical organism subject to the laws of biology and physics. It can track the Emperor's movements, analyze his physical strength and speed, observe the electromagnetic patterns in his brain. All of this is perfectly clear and comprehensible, but the psychic aspect, which is arguably the most important part of what makes the Emperor who he is, remains completely invisible. The Citan cannot see the way the Emperor's consciousness extends into the warp. It cannot perceive the psychic power that he wields with such mastery. It cannot observe the way he manipulates the Imperium to affect the material realm, because it can only see the effects of that manipulation, not the manipulation itself. It would be as if you were trying to understand a puppet show while being unable to see the puppet's strings. You could observe the puppets moving across the stage, could see them, interact with each other and with the scenery. You might even be able to predict their movements based on patterns you observed, but you would fundamentally misunderstand how and why they moved, because the actual mechanism of control would be invisible to you. This is the situation the Citan face when encountering the Emperor. They see a being who seems to violate physical laws, who affects reality in ways that should not be possible through purely material means. They can observe these violations, can even measure their effects with precision, but they cannot understand how they occur, because the mechanism operates in a realm they cannot access. This creates a profound epistemological problem for the Citan. How do you understand a being whose fundamental nature operates according to principles you cannot perceive? How do you assess the threat posed by an enemy whose primary weapons are invisible to you? How do you predict the actions of someone whose decision-making process involves factors you cannot observe or comprehend? The answer, quite simply, is that you cannot. The Citan's understanding of the Emperor will always be incomplete, not because they lack intelligence or observational skills, but because a crucial dimension of what he is remains forever beyond their perception. It is as if they are trying to understand a three-dimensional object while only being able to perceive two dimensions. They can see certain aspects clearly, can make certain observations and inferences, but the full picture will always elude them. This limitation has practical implications for how the Citan might interact with the Emperor. They cannot accurately predict his capabilities because they cannot perceive the source of his power. They cannot fully assess the threat he represents because they cannot observe the most dangerous aspects of what he can do. They cannot develop effective countermeasures against his abilities because they cannot understand the mechanisms by which those abilities operate. Moreover, this limitation affects their ability to learn about the Emperor over time. Normally, when the Citan encounter something they do not understand, they can study it, observe it from multiple angles, conduct experiments to determine its properties and behaviors. This approach works perfectly well for anything in the material realm, where patient observation and analysis will eventually reveal the underlying principles at work. But this approach fails when applied to something that operates primarily in the warp. The Citan can observe the Emperor's actions in the material realm as much as they like, can study every visible aspect of his being with perfect precision, and they will still not gain any insight into the psychic power that is fundamental to who he is. It is not that they need more data. It is that the data they need exists in a form they cannot perceive. There is a certain irony in this situation. The Satan, who pride themselves on their mastery of the material realm, who understand the physical universe with a completeness that no other race can match, are rendered effectively blind when confronting a being whose power comes from somewhere else. The very expertise that makes them so formidable in some contexts becomes a liability when they encounter something that operates according to different rules. This blindness extends beyond just the Emperor's personal power. The Satan also cannot fully comprehend his role in the larger cosmic struggle against chaos. They do not understand that he sits on the golden throne, battling demonic entities in the warp, holding back a tide of corruption that would otherwise overwhelm terror. They cannot perceive the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse he maintains that guides human ships through the warp. They do not grasp the full scope of the threat that chaos represents to the galaxy, because they cannot perceive the warp where chaos originates and where its power is concentrated. From the Citan's perspective, much of what the Emperor does must seem inexplicable or even irrational. Why would such a powerful being constrain himself to a throne, remaining immobile for thousands of years? Why would he spend so much effort guiding and protecting humanity when he could, presumably, simply dominate them through his superior power? Why would he wage war against enemies that seem, from the material perspective, to be little more than dangerous wildlife? The answers to these questions all involve the warp and the threat of chaos. But since the Satan cannot perceive these things directly, they cannot understand the Emperor's motivations or strategies. His actions must appear, to them, as those of a being operating according to incomprehensible principles, pursuing goals that make no sense from a materialistic perspective. This fundamental incomprehension is perhaps the most important fact about what the Satan know, or rather cannot know, about the Emperor. It is not simply that they lack information. It is that they lack the very capacity to understand the most crucial aspects of who he is and what he does. They are trying to solve a puzzle while missing pieces that are essential to making sense of the whole picture. And because of the fundamental nature of their perception, they can never obtain those missing pieces. The Emperor, from the Citan's perspective, will always remain partially unknowable, a being whose full nature they can neither perceive nor comprehend. They can recognize him as powerful, can understand that he represents a threat, can even take measures to avoid or counter him, but they can never truly understand him, because to do so would require them to perceive and comprehend a dimension of reality that is forever beyond their reach. Different shards, different knowledge. The fragmented nature of the Citan in their current state adds another layer of complexity to the question of what they know about the Emperor. Each shard represents a piece of a former god, carrying with it some portion of the original entity's memories, personality, and power. But these fragments are not uniform in what they know or how they think. Understanding this variation is crucial to understanding the full scope of Citan knowledge about the master of mankind. When the Necrons shattered the Citan during their great revolt, they did not simply break each star god into pieces of equal size and capability. The shattering was chaotic and violent, a process that tore apart the Satan's consciousness along with their physical form. Some shards retained significant portions of the original's power and awareness. Others were reduced to fragments so small that they barely possessed independent consciousness at all. The resulting shards vary enormously in their capabilities and awareness. Some are powerful enough to require massive tesseract vaults to contain them, and when deployed in battle, they can reshape reality on a massive scale. Others are much weaker, able to be contained in smaller prisons and possessing only a fraction of their former might. This variation in power is matched by a similar variation in knowledge and memory. No shard possesses complete recall of what the original Citan knew. The process of shattering fragmented memories along with everything else, leaving each shard with only partial recollection of the eons that came before. A shard might remember certain events from the war in heaven, with perfect clarity, while having no memory of other events that occurred at the same time. It might possess detailed knowledge of certain technologies or tactics, while completely forgetting others. The memories are like pieces of a shattered mirror, each one reflecting some portion of the whole, but none of them providing a complete picture. Moreover, the personality traits of each shard are influenced by which aspects of the original Citan's consciousness it contains. A shard might embody the cunning and manipulative nature of the deceiver, while lacking the patience or strategic thinking that balance those traits in the original. Another shard of the same Citan might possess the strategic thinking but lack the cunning, resulting in a being that thinks and acts quite differently from its sibling shards. This fragmentation means that different shards of the same Citan might have very different knowledge about the Emperor. The shard of the Void Dragon that encountered the Emperor directly in ancient times retains memories of that battle, memories that inform its understanding of what the Master of Mankind is capable of. But other shards of the Void Dragon, imprisoned in different Necron tomb worlds across the galaxy, might have no knowledge of that encounter at all. They were created from different portions of the dragon's consciousness, portions that did not include the memories of fighting the Golden Warrior in ancient times. The situation is even more complex when we consider shards of different Citan. Each of the star gods had different experiences during the war in heaven and afterward. The Nightbringer fought different battles than the Deceiver, encountered different enemies, learned different lessons. When these Citan were shattered, their shards inherited different sets of memories and knowledge. A shard of the Nightbringer might know things about the nature of death and fear that a Deceiver shard does not, while the Deceiver shard might possess knowledge of manipulation and strategy that the Nightbringer shard lacks. None of the Citan shards, regardless of which star god they came from, are likely to have direct memories of encountering the Emperor, with one possible exception. The dragon's shard that was imprisoned on Mars is the only one we know for certain had a direct encounter with him in ancient times. Other Citan shards might have crossed paths with the Emperor at various points in history, particularly during the long ages when he walked through human civilization in disguise, but we have no records of such encounters. However, even shards that never encountered the Emperor directly might possess some knowledge relevant to understanding him. During the war in heaven, the Citan fought against the psychic races created by the Old Ones. They learned to recognize the signs of warp-based power, developed strategies for fighting against beings who wielded such abilities. This knowledge would be distributed across all the shards of all the Citan, though each shard would possess only a portion of it. A shard might remember fighting against Aeldari warlocks during the war in heaven and recognize similar patterns in the Emperor's manifestation of power. Another shard might recall the way reality bent and flexed around the most powerful psykers of that ancient age, and see the same phenomena when observing the Emperor. These memories would provide context for understanding what kind of being the Emperor is, even if the shard had never encountered him personally. There is also the question of whether shards can share knowledge with each other. According to some accounts, shards of the same Citan are drawn to each other, feeling a pull to reunite and reform the original entity. If two shards do manage to merge, they would presumably share their memories with each other, combining their knowledge into a more complete whole. This means that knowledge of the Emperor, possessed by one shard, might, over time, spread to other shards of the same Citan if they manage to find and reabsorb each other. But this process of merging is rare and dangerous. The Necrons are very careful to prevent it, knowing that allowing shards to reunite would eventually result in the reformation of the full Citan, a catastrophe they barely survived once and would not survive again. Most shards remain isolated from each other, locked away in separate prisons or deployed in separate battles, with no opportunity to share their knowledge or experiences. The isolation of the shards means that knowledge about the Emperor remains scattered and fragmented across multiple entities that have little or no contact with each other. The dragon shard on Mars knows one thing. A deceiver shard that may have observed human civilization from afar knows something else. And a Nightbringer shard deployed by a Necron dynasty might know nothing at all. There is no unified Citan understanding of the Emperor, because there is no unified Citan consciousness to hold such an understanding. This fragmentation has important implications for how the Citan might respond to the Emperor if they encounter him in the present age. A shard that knows of the dragon's defeat might be more cautious, might recognize the Emperor as a genuine threat to be avoided or approached with care. A shard that has no such knowledge might attack without hesitation, unaware of the danger until it is too late. The variation in shard knowledge also means that even within a single Necron dynasty, different Citan shards might provide different assessments of the Emperor if asked. One shard might warn that he is extraordinarily dangerous and should be given a wide berth. Another might dismiss him as merely another powerful psyker, no more threatening than the Aeldari warlocks they faced during the war in Heaven. Both assessments would be based on genuine Citan knowledge, but each would be incomplete because each shard possesses only a fragment of the full picture. There is one final aspect to consider: the possibility of free shards, Catan fragments that have escaped Necron control and are operating independently. According to Imperial records, there are isolated reports of such entities across the galaxy. These free shards would have even less access to collective Citan knowledge than those imprisoned by the Necrons. They would be entirely dependent on whatever memories they personally possess, with no way to learn from other shards or access the records kept by Necron cryptex. A free shard that happened to contain memories of the dragon's encounter with the Emperor would possess valuable knowledge that could inform its actions. But a free shard lacking such memories would be operating entirely in the dark, forced to assess the Emperor based solely on what it could directly observe and what general principles it remembered from the war in Heaven. Such a shard might make poor decisions, might underestimate the threat the Emperor represents, or overestimate its own ability to counter him. In summary, the knowledge that the Citan possess about the Emperor is not a unified body of information. It is scattered across multiple shards, each with partial memories and incomplete understanding. Some shards know much, having encountered the Emperor directly or possessing memories of similar beings from the war in Heaven. Others know little or nothing, their portion of the original Catan's consciousness, not including any relevant experiences or information. This fragmentation mirrors the broader state of the Citan in the current age. They are no longer unified gods but scattered fragments, each one operating independently with only partial access to what their progenitors knew. Their understanding of the Emperor is similarly fragmented, a mosaic of partial insights and incomplete knowledge spread across entities that may never have the opportunity to share what they know with each other. The Emperor's dual nature. To fully understand what makes the Emperor incomprehensible to the Citan, we must examine what sets him apart from other beings they have encountered. The key lies in his dual nature, his simultaneous existence and mastery of both the material realm and the Imperium. This duality makes him fundamentally different from anything the Citan faced during the war in Heaven, and it is this difference that places him beyond their complete understanding. Throughout their long existence, the Citan have encountered many powerful beings. During the war in Heaven, they fought against the Old Ones, who wielded great psychic power and had mastered the webway. They battled the psychic races the Old Ones created, beings like the ancient Aeldari, whose connection to the warp gave them formidable abilities. They even clashed with entities from the warp itself, the warp-spawned weapons that would eventually evolve into the Aeldari gods. But all of these beings fell into one of two categories. They were either primarily material entities, with some connection to the warp, like the psychic races, or they were primarily warp entities that could manifest in the material realm, like the demon weapons and proto-gods. None of them truly existed equally in both realms simultaneously. None of them had achieved the kind of balance between material and immaterial that the Emperor represents. The psychic races of the War in Heaven era were powerful, but they were still fundamentally biological organisms. They had bodies that could be destroyed, physical forms that were subject to the normal laws of biology and physics. Their psychic abilities allowed them to manipulate reality in ways that seemed miraculous, but they were still vulnerable to conventional weapons, if those weapons could reach them. The Citan learned to fight them by overwhelming their defenses with superior material force, by deploying weapons and tactics that could kill or incapacitate them before their psychic powers could turn the tide of battle. The warp entities the Citan encountered were the opposite problem. These beings existed primarily or entirely in the Imperium, manifesting in the material realm only temporarily or partially. They could be driven back by the right kinds of attacks, could be banished from reality if their connection to the physical world was severed. More importantly, they were fundamentally creatures of the warp, operating according to its chaotic and emotion-driven principles. The Citan could not understand them fully, but they could at least recognize them as beings that belong to that incomprehensible other realm. The Emperor fits neither of these patterns. He possesses a physical body that exists fully and completely in the material realm. This is not a temporary manifestation or a lesser avatar, but his actual presence, as real and solid as any other physical object. The Citan can perceive this body with perfect clarity, can observe every detail of its structure and function. In this sense, he is like the psychic races they fought during the War in Heaven, a biological entity that can be located, targeted, and potentially destroyed through material means. But unlike those ancient psychic races, the Emperor's physical form is not his primary vulnerability. His consciousness extends deep into the warp, his soul burning with a psychic power that dwarfs anything the ancient Eldari or other War in Heaven-era races could manage. He is not simply a powerful psyker who can manipulate the warp. He is a being whose very existence is intertwined with it. His awareness spans both realms simultaneously, allowing him to perceive and act in ways that purely material or purely warp-based entities cannot. This dual nature gives the Emperor capabilities that the Citan have no frame of reference for understanding. He can fight in the material realm with physical weapons and enhanced strength, engaging enemies in direct combat, using tactics and strategies the Citan can recognize and potentially counter. But at the same time, he can wage battles in the warp, confronting demon entities and manipulating the currents of the Imperium in ways that are completely invisible to Citan perception. Consider what this means in practical terms. When the Void Dragon Shard fought the Emperor in ancient times, it was facing an opponent who operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The physical combat was only part of the battle. The Emperor was also fighting on a psychic level, using his warp-based abilities to predict the dragon's movements, to shore up his defenses, to strike at vulnerabilities the dragon could not even perceive itself as having. From the dragon's perspective, this must have been profoundly disorienting. It could see the Emperor's physical form, could track his movements, and predict his attacks according to the normal principles of physics and combat. But things kept happening that did not make sense from a purely material standpoint. Attacks that should have connected were deflected by invisible forces. The Emperor seemed to know where to strike, even before the dragon had fully committed to its own attacks. The very laws of probability seemed to bend in the Emperor's favor in ways that should not have been possible. The dragon could observe these anomalies, could recognize that something beyond the material was influencing the battle, but it could not perceive or understand what that something was. It was as if the Emperor were playing a game while able to see the entire board, while the dragon could only see half of it. The dragon could still potentially win, still had advantages in certain areas, but it was fundamentally fighting at a disadvantage because it could not fully perceive its opponent. This same pattern would hold true for any Citan shard encountering the Emperor. They would face an opponent who operates according to principles they cannot fully grasp, who wields powers from sources they cannot perceive, who makes decisions based on information they cannot access. It is not simply that the Emperor is powerful, though he is certainly that. It is that he is powerful in ways that bypass or transcend the C'tan's understanding of how power should work. The Emperor's dual nature also manifests in his knowledge and understanding of the universe. As a being who exists in both realms, he has access to information from both sources. He understands the material universe with the precision of a scientist, an engineer who has spent millennia studying its laws. But he also understands the warp with the insight of someone who has navigated its depths and battled its denizens. He knows things about the nature of reality that beings who exist solely in one realm or the other cannot know, because he has access to perspectives from both sides. This comprehensive understanding extends to his knowledge of the C'tan themselves. The Emperor knows what they are, understands their nature and capabilities, recognizes both their strengths and their limitations. His battle with the Dragon Shard demonstrates this knowledge clearly. He knew where to strike, how to contain the entity, what methods would be effective in imprisoning it. This suggests a level of understanding about C'tan nature that should not be accessible to any race except the Necrons, who created the star gods' bodies and later imprisoned them. Where did this knowledge come from? The most likely explanation is that the Emperor gained it through his warp-based perception and his long study of the galaxy's history. Through psychic means, he could potentially access information about the war in heaven and the entities that fought in it. Through careful study of Xenos ruins and artifacts, he could learn about the technologies and tactics used by various ancient races. And through his own direct observation and analysis, he could piece together an understanding of what the C'tan are and how they function. The C'tan, lacking any comparable ability to access information from the warp, cannot fully replicate this comprehensive understanding. They know about the Emperor only what they can directly observe or infer from material evidence. They cannot access the histories and memories stored in the warp, cannot perceive the psychic signatures that might reveal crucial information about his nature and capabilities. Their understanding remains incomplete, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack access to crucial sources of information. The Emperor's dual nature also makes him uniquely positioned to be a threat to both warp-based and material entities. Against demons and other immaterial beings, he can bring to bear not just psychic might, but also material force, using weapons and technologies that such entities are often ill-equipped to defend against. Against material beings like the C'tan, he can employ not just physical combat, but also psychic attacks that bypass their material defenses and strike at their essential nature. This versatility is what makes the Emperor such a formidable opponent. He is not specialized in one realm or the other. He is a master of both. He can adapt his tactics and strategies to counter whatever kind of threat he faces, bringing to bear whichever set of abilities is most effective in any given situation. Against the Dragon Shard, he combined physical combat skill with psychic power and deep knowledge of C'tan nature, creating a synergistic approach that none of these elements alone could have achieved. The C'tan, for all their power and ancient wisdom, have no equivalent versatility. They are supreme masters of the material realm, but completely blind to the immaterial. They cannot adapt to face opponents who operate primarily in the warp, cannot employ psychic tactics to complement their reality-warping material abilities. This limitation is not a weakness in the conventional sense, but it does represent a fundamental constraint on their capabilities, a boundary beyond which they cannot extend their power. In the Emperor, the C'tan face something that challenges the very foundations of their understanding. He represents a form of existence they cannot fully comprehend, a combination of traits they cannot replicate, a level of versatility they cannot match. He is, in a very real sense, the answer to the question, what if a being could master both realms that the C'tan and the Chaos gods each claim exclusively? This makes the Emperor, not just powerful, but incomprehensible to the Citan. They can recognize his power, can understand that he represents a threat, can even take measures to counter or avoid him. But they can never fully understand him, because to do so would require them to perceive and comprehend a dimension of reality that is forever beyond their reach. He remains, from their perspective, a being who operates according to rules that make no sense, who wields powers that should not be possible, who achieves effects that have no material explanation. And perhaps this incomprehensibility is itself a form of power. By being beyond the Citan's ability to fully understand, the Emperor remains unpredictable to them, his actions and capabilities not fully accessible by beings who are used to understanding everything in their domain with perfect clarity. He is a wild card in their calculations, an unknown variable that cannot be fully accounted for. And for beings as ancient and calculating as the Citan, the unknown is perhaps more threatening than any known danger could be. Modern implications. As we approach the end of our exploration, we must consider what the Citan's limited knowledge of the Emperor means in the current age. The 41st millennium, when both the Necrons and their imprisoned star gods are awakening across the galaxy. The relationship between these ancient entities and the Master of Mankind has implications that extend far beyond historical curiosity, touching on the very future of the galaxy itself. The Great Awakening of the Necrons has been underway for centuries now, with tomb worlds stirring to life across the galaxy. As the Necrons wake, they bring with them their Citan shards, deploying these fragments of ancient gods as weapons in their campaigns to reclaim the galaxy they once ruled. More Citan shards are active now than at any time since the end of the war in heaven, and each awakening brings with it the possibility of encountering the Emperor or his servants. But the Emperor that the Citan might encounter now is very different from the one that the Dragon Shard fought in ancient times. The Master of Mankind no longer walks through the galaxy in physical form. Instead, he sits immobile upon the golden throne, his body slowly crumbling while his consciousness battles against demonic entities in the warp. His physical presence is confined to a single location, the throne room deep within the Imperial Palace on Terra, where he has remained for over 10,000 years. From the perspective of a Citan shard, this transformation must be deeply puzzling. If one could somehow show a shard that has never encountered the Emperor before a vision of both his ancient form and his current state, what would that shard make of the difference? In ancient times, the Emperor was physically active, traveling across Terra and beyond, confronting threats directly with both material and psychic might. Now, he appears diminished, constrained, perhaps even defeated. But this appearance would be deeply misleading. The Emperor's true battle now takes place entirely in a realm the Citan cannot perceive. He wages constant war against the forces of chaos in the warp, holding back a tide of corruption that would otherwise overwhelm not just Terra, but the entire galaxy. He maintains the Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that guides human ships through the warp, and without which the Imperium would collapse into isolated fragments. He projects his consciousness across vast distances, manifesting as the Legion of the Damned or sending visions and guidance to his followers. All of this activity is completely invisible to the Citan. When they observe the Emperor's current state, they see only a failing body on a throne, maintained by ancient machinery and the sacrifice of thousands of psykers daily. They cannot perceive the vast psychic struggle being waged in the warp, cannot understand the importance of the Astronomicon, cannot recognize the way the Emperor's consciousness extends across the galaxy to influence events far from Terra. This creates a dangerous situation for any Citan shard that might decide to move against the Emperor directly. Seeing what appears to be a weakened or incapacitated opponent, a shard might conclude that now is the opportune time to destroy this being that the dragon's memories mark as a threat. But such an assessment would be fatally incomplete, based on observing only the material aspect while remaining blind to the far more dangerous psychic reality. The Void Dragon Shard, imprisoned on Mars, presents a particularly interesting case. This is the shard that encountered the Emperor directly, that carries memories of being defeated and bound by him. It has spent thousands of years beneath the Martian surface, its presence influencing the Adeptus Mechanicus and shaping their technological development. Throughout this time, it has been aware, to some degree, of what transpires on the surface and across the solar system. The dragon must know that the Emperor sits on the golden throne. It must be aware of the Imperium that has been built in his name, the vast civilization that spans the galaxy and venerates him as a god. But what does the dragon make of this? Does it see the Emperor's current state as vindication, proof that even this mighty being eventually failed and fell? Or does it recognize something more complex, some deeper purpose or plan that extends beyond what material observation can reveal? There is also the question of what other Necron dynasties might know about the Emperor through their C'tan shards. Some dynasties may possess shards that carry memories relevant to understanding him. Others may have shards that know nothing of the Emperor at all, having been isolated from the portions of C'tan consciousness that encountered or observed him. This variation in knowledge could lead to very different strategies and responses depending on which dynasty is involved. A dynasty whose C'tan shards warn of the Emperor's power might choose to avoid direct conflict with the Imperium, or at least to approach such conflicts with appropriate caution and preparation. A dynasty whose shards have no such knowledge might be more aggressive, unaware of the danger until they encounter it directly. This could lead to costly mistakes, with Necron forces underestimating the threat posed by the Emperor's servants, and suffering defeats they might have avoided with better information. There is also the possibility of free C'tan shards seeking out the Emperor specifically. Some shards, particularly those that have escaped Necron control and are pursuing their own agendas, might be curious about this being that the dragon's memories mark as significant. They might approach Terra, seeking to observe or even confront the Emperor directly. Such encounters could have unpredictable results, depending on what the shard knows and what it hopes to achieve. But perhaps the most important implication of the C'tan's limited knowledge concerns what might happen if they attempt to interfere with the Emperor's current role. Suppose a particularly powerful C'tan shard, or even multiple shards working in concert, decided to attack Terra directly. Suppose they somehow managed to bypass or destroy the Emperor's physical form, believing this would eliminate the threat he represents. The result would likely be catastrophic, not just for the Imperium, but for the entire galaxy. The Emperor's consciousness is all that stands between Terra and the daemonic entities that constantly seek to breach into reality through the wound in the webway beneath the Imperial Palace. His psychic might maintain the Astronomicon, without which warp travel becomes nearly impossible. His presence serves as a beacon and anchor point for human psychers across the galaxy. If the Emperor were to be destroyed, or even significantly weakened, the consequences would cascade across multiple levels. Terra would be overwhelmed by demonic invasion. The Astronomicon would fail, cutting off countless Imperial worlds from each other and from any hope of reinforcement or aid. The Imperium would fragment into isolated pockets, easy prey for any enemy that chose to attack. And the forces of chaos, suddenly freed from their greatest mortal opponent, would sweep across the galaxy in a tide of corruption that even the ancient Necrons and their C'tan shards might not be able to resist. The C'tan, unable to perceive the psychic reality of the situation, might not realize any of this until it was too late. They might destroy what they perceive as a weakened enemy, only to discover that they have unleashed something far worse. It would be like removing a keystone from an arch, not understanding that this one piece is all that holds the entire structure together. The material consequences would be observable, but by the time the C'tan realized what they had done, the damage would already be irreversible. This potential for catastrophic miscalculation highlights the danger of the C'tan's incomplete knowledge. They operate with only partial information, making decisions based on what they can perceive while remaining blind to crucial factors that might change their assessment entirely. In the case of the Emperor, this blindness could lead them to make moves that, while appearing rational based on available information, actually work against their own interests and survival. There is one final implication worth considering: the possibility of cooperation or communication between the Emperor and C'tan shards. Given that the Emperor understands both realms and possesses knowledge of C'tan nature, he might theoretically be able to communicate with or even manipulate C'tan shards in ways that other beings cannot. He might be able to exploit their blindness to the warp, using psychic influence they cannot perceive to shape their actions or perceptions. Whether the Emperor has ever attempted such manipulation is unknown, but the theoretical possibility exists, and it represents yet another advantage he possesses in any interaction with the ancient star gods. They cannot fully perceive or understand him, but he can perceive and understand them, at least to a significant degree. This asymmetry of knowledge and perception gives him a profound advantage in any potential conflict or negotiation. As the galaxy enters a new age of conflict, with the Necrons awakening, the forces of chaos growing stronger, and the Imperium struggling to survive, the relationship between the Emperor and the C'tan remains a wild card. What they know about him is limited but significant. What they do not know about him is perhaps even more important, and how they choose to act on their incomplete knowledge could have consequences that echo across the galaxy for ages to come. Conclusion: the unknowable God Emperor. We have journeyed through 60 million years of history, from the birth of the C'tan in the universe's infancy to the present age where both they and the Emperor shape the fate of the galaxy. We have examined the nature of C'tan perception, explored the Emperor's dual existence in both material and immaterial realms, and considered what ancient star gods can and cannot know about the master of mankind. Now, as we bring this exploration to a close, we must synthesize these threads into a final understanding of this cosmic relationship. What do the C'tan know about the Emperor? They know he is powerful, possessing abilities that rival their own in certain respects and exceed them in others. They know, or at least the Void Dragon Shard knows, that he can defeat and imprison a C'tan, demonstrating both the martial skill and the knowledge necessary to overcome a being of near godlike power. They know he operates according to principles that include, but also transcend the material realm, wielding forces that produce observable effects, even though the forces themselves remain invisible to C'tan perception. They know he is ancient, far older than his species should allow, suggesting either an origin that predates the current age, or abilities that grant effective immortality. They know he possesses knowledge that should not be accessible to humanity, understanding things about the C'tan and other ancient entities that suggests access to information from the War in Heaven era. They know he has shaped human civilization in profound ways, guiding its development across thousands of years, according to plans whose full scope remains unclear even to those he guides. But what they do not know is equally important, perhaps more so. They do not know the true nature of his power, the connection to the warp that is fundamental to who he is. They cannot perceive his psychic might, cannot sense his soul, cannot observe the vast battles he wages in the Imperium against entities they cannot comprehend. They do not understand his purpose or motivations, cannot grasp the relationship he has with humanity or the sacrifices he has made in their service. They do not know that he is holding back a demonic tide that would otherwise overwhelm terror. They cannot perceive the Astronomicon he maintains or understand its importance to the Imperium's survival. They do not comprehend the worship directed toward him by billions of believers, nor can they sense how that worship feeds back into his power through mechanisms that operate entirely in the warp. They do not know that his current immobility on the Golden Throne represents not weakness, but a different kind of strength, a cosmic struggle waged on battlefields they cannot perceive. This incomplete knowledge creates a fundamental asymmetry. The C'tan face a being who can perceive and understand them, at least to a significant degree, while they cannot fully perceive or understand him. It is as if they are playing a game where their opponent can see the entire board while they can see only half of it. They are not helpless, not without their own formidable advantages and capabilities, but they are fundamentally disadvantaged by their inability to perceive crucial aspects of reality. This asymmetry has existed since the dragon's encounter with the Emperor in ancient times, and it persists into the present age. If anything, it has become more pronounced, because the Emperor's role now involves aspects that are almost entirely psychic in nature. The physical form the Satan can perceive is a shell, a housing for a consciousness that operates primarily in a realm they cannot access. They might observe the Golden Throne and conclude the Emperor is weakened or constrained, never realizing that his true activity occurs in dimensions beyond their perception. There is a certain irony in this situation. The Satan, who pride themselves on being masters of reality, who understand the material universe with a completeness that no other race can match, find themselves unable to fully comprehend one of their potential adversaries. Their very nature, which gives them such extraordinary power in some contexts, becomes a limitation when they encounter beings like the Emperor, who exist at the intersection of material and immaterial realities. This irony extends to the knowledge problem itself. The Satan cannot know what they do not know about the Emperor. They can recognize that his actions sometimes have effects they cannot explain through purely material mechanisms, can observe that reality behaves strangely in his presence in ways that suggest forces beyond their perception. But they cannot quantify this gap in their knowledge, cannot assess how much they are missing or how important the unseen aspects might be. They are aware of their blindness without being able to see what that blindness hides from them. For humanity and the Imperium, the Satan's incomplete knowledge of the Emperor might represent a strategic advantage. Enemies who cannot fully understand the master of mankind, cannot fully anticipate his actions or capabilities. They may underestimate him, misjudge situations, make decisions based on incomplete information that lead them into traps or conflicts they would have avoided with better understanding. The very incomprehensibility that frustrates the Satan provides a layer of protection for the Emperor and those he guards. But this advantage cuts both ways. The Satan's inability to understand the Emperor also makes them unpredictable in how they might respond to him. A fully informed opponent might choose to avoid direct conflict, recognizing the danger. An opponent operating with incomplete information might attack when they should withdraw, might attempt strategies that have no chance of success, or might inadvertently trigger consequences they did not foresee. The unpredictability that comes from incomplete knowledge can be as dangerous as intentional malice. In the final analysis, the relationship between the Satan and the Emperor is defined by this fundamental gap in understanding. They are beings that exist at opposite ends of a spectrum, one purely material and one spanning both realms, one unable to perceive the warp and one intimately connected to it. This makes them natural antagonists in some respects, but it also makes them fundamentally unable to fully understand each other. The Satan see the Emperor as a powerful but incomprehensible opponent, one whose actions often make no sense from a materialistic perspective, but who has proven capable of defeating even star gods. The Emperor sees the Satan as ancient enemies of life itself, predators who fed on the galaxy during the war in heaven, and whose awakening in the present age represents a threat to humanity's survival. Both assessments are true as far as they go, but both are also incomplete, shaped by the limitations of perception and understanding that constrain even beings of godlike power. As the galaxy enters an age of unprecedented conflict, with multiple ancient powers awakening and clashing, this relationship between the Satan and the Emperor will likely become increasingly important. How they interact, how they respond to each other's actions, how they navigate the fundamental incompatibility of their natures, these factors could help determine the fate of countless worlds and civilizations. And at the center of it all is a question that has persisted for thousands of years. What do the ancient star gods really know about the master of mankind? We have explored this question from every angle available to us, examining the nature of Satan perception, the Emperor's dual existence, the fragmentary knowledge carried by individual shards, and the implications for the current age. And the answer we have reached is both simple and profound. The Satan know some things about the Emperor, enough to recognize him as powerful and potentially threatening, but they do not and cannot know the most important things, the aspects of his nature and purpose that operate in a realm beyond their perception. He remains, to them, partially unknowable, a being whose full nature will forever elude their understanding. And perhaps that is fitting, for in a universe as vast and strange as that of Warhammer 40,000, where reality itself is contested between material and immaterial forces, there should be mysteries that even the oldest and most powerful beings cannot fully solve. The Emperor stands as one such mystery, a figure who bridges worlds and dimensions, who commands powers from multiple sources, who pursues purposes that span millennia. The Satan can observe him, can recognize him as significant, can even fight against him, but they cannot fully understand him, and that incomprehension shapes everything about how these ancient forces interact. In the end, the question, what do the Satan know about the Emperor, has led us to a deeper question. What does it mean to truly know another being? The Satan's knowledge of the Emperor is extensive in some ways, covering aspects of his physical presence, his historical actions, his capabilities as demonstrated in battle. But it is also fundamentally incomplete, missing the dimension that arguably defines him most completely. They know the shadow, but not the substance, the effect but not the cause, the manifestation but not the source. And in this incompleteness lies both danger and possibility. Danger, because beings who cannot fully understand each other can make catastrophic mistakes in how they interact. Possibility, because the existence of the unknowable reminds us that even in a universe mapped and catalogued and measured, there remain mysteries that transcend understanding, beings that exist beyond the grasp of even the most ancient and powerful entities. The Emperor remains such a mystery to the Satan, and perhaps that is how it should be. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the vast and ancient history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If you found this exploration of what the Satan know about the Emperor insightful or interesting, please consider subscribing to Q on 40K for more deep dives into the lore and mysteries of the grim darkness of the far future. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and let me know in the comments what other cosmic questions you'd like to see explored. The Emperor protects, and so does the knowledge we gather about this vast and terrifying universe. Until next time.